Today, Open Source Security is talking with Brian Fox, the co-founder and CTO of Sonatype, and a good friend of mine. So, Brian, welcome back to the show, man. It's a treat.
Yeah. Yeah, good to be back here.
And we've got a doozy of a topic today. Like, holy cow! So,
Yeah.
you are
Yeah.
part of a group that wrote an open letter as. Feel free to just jump in and correct me as I get any of this wrong. An open letter, was it published by the OpenSSF or through the OpenSSF? I don't know kind of the detail there.
Yeah, I mean, it unfolded in a weird way, but yes, it was published on the OpenSSF blog.
Okay.
They signed on at the end, but it is a group of basically all the public registries, Maven Central, PyPI, PHP. I heard Perl is signing it now after the fact,
Nice.
which is great. Alpha Omega, OpenSSF, OpenJS, Eclipse Foundation, right? And so we kind of decided that a good neutral spot was the OpenSSF to publish it.
Awesome. And
But there was a lot of good reception there, so they joined on as official signatories as well. Yeah,
that's cool. And the title of the letter is an open letter from the stewards of public open source infrastructure. And I feel like the titles and names you just listed aren't the stewards of open source infrastructure. They are the foundation of modern society. Where like if any of these organizations disappeared, civilization collapses.
At least for a couple weeks or months while people pick up the pieces. Yeah. Some of them it could be a mess, right? So, yeah, what are we talking about here? I mean, we're talking about basically all of the open source and other, and I'm sure we'll come back to the other, but all of the open source supply chain for all the modern languages are signed on here, right? And because we all share the same problem of overconsumption of these free resources that are meant for open source.
Okay, I want to dig into that because I feel like there's maybe a misunderstanding of sometimes the concept of open source. So there's open source, the licenses, and then there's like open source, this infrastructure, which you are part of Maven Central and you listed off a whole bunch of other repos. But fundamentally, these are volunteer organizations that are hosting an enormous amount of data. And quite frankly, they're running the world. I mean, you talk about this in your letter. You're the CDN for the world, functionally speaking, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so if you think about open source, historically, right, it started as, well, we're writing software, which is words, basically, at the end of the day. We're publishing those and we're making them available for other people to do what they want with, whether they want to extend them, copy them, do all these other things, right? That's like the purest form of open source is literally I've made the source code available. But starting, I think Maven credibly was one of the first that kind of started doing this. We started providing the actual built binary artifacts as a convenience artifact, which then very quickly became the de facto artifacts, right? Like in modern open source, people don't really download the source code and rebuild these things from scratch like that. Right. I used to have to do that in the super early days of open source, but it was hard. Trying to figure out how to build somebody else's stuff is hard, right? And so I would say that the rise of binary packages across all these ecosystems actually contributed to the boom of open source that we saw over the past couple of decades, right? It became easy to include these things. And then you think about packaging tools like Maven and others that can deal with all of the transitive dependencies. So you pull in one thing and it pulls in 10 more. That can be hard to manage.
Nothing pulls in 10, Brian.
10, you're right. 10, 100, if it's JavaScript, 1,000 or 10,000 other things, right? And so doing that automatically from these registries is what actually makes it, possible to rapidly consume and build on top of open source. And that's all great. That's what these registries were built for, to make it possible to have a place to share the metadata and the packages themselves for consumers to be able to use. And that's all great. But what we've observed is over time, the the usual psychology of humans of overgrazing the fields kind of starts to
Yes.
come into play. And, I've been on this journey for about a year at least, in terms of trying to bend the curve of the growth, of the consumption. Every year the growth of Central in terms of downloads looks like a hockey stick. So it's like
Yeah.
fractal. Every year it's the same shape, it's just bigger. Um,
Yes.
and that's true of all package registries, really. But the when I started looking into it, and I I think we probably talked about this on a podcast sometime last year. We found that um, it was less than 1% of the global IPs were driving more than 80% of my traffic, right? So it was extreme at the high end. And so we started implementing rate limits and trying to calm the traffic there, and that created some interesting learnings. And then we started looking at organizations that instead of from a single IP number, they were coming from dozens or in some cases multiple of thousands of IP numbers distributed across a single organization. And these are giant commercial organizations. Let's be clear. These are not open source publishers, developers, working on these things. These are organizations who their commercial software is built on top of this stuff. And I found some instances of organizations that were re-downloading, sets of 10 to 20,000 jars, re-downloading them on average 500,000 times a month, over and
Shot.
over and over again, right? And in Maven, the jars don't change. It's canonical. You can only add new things. You can't change things there. So if you've downloaded it once, you don't need to download it 499,000 more times. It is, I promise you, it is the same. And so we started putting some limits in place to try to calm that traffic as well. And what I started to uncover, and I kind of chronicled this in a series of blogs, I started to uncover systemic challenges where it wasn't usually the case that there was like intentional abuse going on. It was decisions made by others in the ecosystem, other build tools, other security tools, just were like, oh, Maven Central is available. It's highly available. It's super fast and it's free. So why should I implement any caching for my tool? That's hard. I'm just going to lean on this stuff. And so what we've uncovered is like I said, the usual thing is when things are perceived to be free and infinite, it changes the economic decisions that the consumers make. It's literally the tragedy of the commons kind of problem. And in talking to my peers at other ecosystems, I realized they are all in kind of the same situation. And certainly if you're a not for profit and your funding all comes from donations and memberships, those are hard to maintain, right? But why would you join one of these open source foundations merely to pay the bandwidth bill for a bunch of maybe bigger organizations than you just doing things
Right.
without caching? Like, that's not exciting to anybody, and yet that's fundamentally what's been happening here. And the open source ecosystem's ability to attract donations is kind of a zero-sum game. So if we're taking this money and applying it to infrastructure, basically paying for various forms of abuse, it by definition means that money's not available to help with the maintainers, right? And so, this conversation around infrastructure is actually kind of a new one. And that was sort of the epiphany I had back in May. We've all been talking about raising money to pay the maintainers forever, and it hasn't been terribly effective, but we never talk about the infrastructure underneath these things. And I do think there's reason to be optimistic because these things are not optional. Organizations worldwide are dependent upon them. And if we approach regulating this a little bit better, it might actually provide some money. It's certainly going to free up money that's currently going to donate to these infrastructure pieces, but we might be able to produce extra streams that can, in fact, go to pay the maintainer. So I think it's all interrelated, but we haven't been talking about this part of the problem.
Holy cow. That's a lot to unpack, man. Okay. So I'm going to put a link to the letter in the show notes. But as I told Brian before I hit record, like I went to take notes on this letter and I'm like, the whole letter is the note. Like
Hmm.
it's very, very dense. But I think that's okay. And I think this is an important problem. And I think there are a couple pieces in here that really stuck out to me as kind of like an oh moment. And the
Hmm.
first is the proprietary software distribution angle, which I
Oh
hadn't
yeah.
really thought about before, but and this is so true though, right? There are proprietary services, web services many of us use that have like SDKs in these public repos, but those SDKs only work with their service. So it's not like it's some sort
Hmm.
of reusable open source, which you point out in the letter. And
Hmm.
like that, ah, man, that feels so weird now that someone says it out loud. And I hadn't really put that together prior to this. Like,
Yeah, it's funny because some of this comes, sort of surreptitiously. We were doing a big migration of the publishing mechanism on Maven Central over the summer, and the team was overloaded with migration related issues. So I jumped in, to help. I was doing frontline support on Maven Central, which surprised a lot of people. But I'm the kind of guy, I'll get in the boat and row with you if we need to. And what I observed was like, there's a lot of support tickets coming in here from very angry people with commercial signatures in their email. And, and I didn't think much of it at first. And then I started to really pay closer attention, and I was like, wait a minute, why are these companies complaining about the validation rule that requires their source be open? They're saying, I don't want to publish my source. And I'm like, hold on,
oh,
this is an open source repository. So let's take a little bit of a closer look, and we found that there were cases where people were creating empty source components just to trick the validation. Um, and so I started pulling on that thread a little bit, and I found other instances where, the downloads were almost all from browsers and not from the package tools. And it's like, wait, so I Google that URL and I find like, oh, right, this commercial entity is using the link on their website to download their software, goes directly to
holy
Maven Central,
crap.
right? So that's literally the free CDN. Like, why would you do that? Well, because I'm not paying for it and it's free. And so that's the kind of the sort of side abuse that I'm talking about. It's each one most of the time is small, but in aggregate it's quite large. And if we look at the number of easily identifiable commercial publishers across just my package registry, we're talking tens of thousands. Right now,
Sure.
some of these might be publishing real open source projects. Some of them are publishing SDKs that are quote unquote open source, but like you pointed out, really only work with their service. So they're intricately tied to a paid service. And then there's some that are just clearly like commercial binaries that aren't even open source at all and are still kicking around. And so
Wow.
trying to figure out how to balance that is a challenge, because like the CRA, it's hard to define what is commercial, right? So I'm
Right.
not claiming to have cracked that nut yet, but I have observed that this can be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Um, but the other interesting thing is sort of these tools that have depend upon it. And we just cut over Central to a new CDN provider at the end of September, so two days ago, as we're talking about this now.
Nice.
And we moved a petabyte a day of traffic from one CDN to another
Whoa.
overnight, and shockingly there were very few problems, but there was one really big problem that we had no way of anticipating. Cloudflare has much better protections for denial of service and bots and things like that, which is why we are excited to do this, because it can help us get control over all of these costs. Well, it identified what appeared to be a denial of service attack because there was a bunch of stuff coming in with unusual user agents, which happened to be Python. Now, think about that for a minute. Maven Central is about Java. So Kotlin, Gradle, Ant, Maven, these are all the things you expect. You don't expect Python code to be downloading Java dependencies. And the tool automatically flagged that and blocked it. So I wake up the next morning and I have a whole bunch of emails from I'm going to not name names here because my goal is not to name and shame, but use it as an example, from an open source project, um, asking what was going on. And I said, okay, we see the problem. Help me understand your use case here. I don't really understand what's actually happening here. I check our support portal and we have a whole bunch of support tickets from a whole bunch of companies that are much, much larger than us, asking why this infrastructure is broken that I have no understanding of. Well, come to find out, what's actually happened is an open source project that deals with processing big data and AI-based workflows um, had hard coded some URLs into their Python scripts for fetching dependencies in an operational context. So every time a pipeline for processing data started up on a worker agent, it was re-downloading the same components over and over again, and these were inadvertently blocked, right? But what I then found out was that there was another global player who had built this thing into a very big service that they provide to the world that was also dependent upon this download. So basically, all of their big data customers were also getting inadvertently messed up on this. And as we unpack this, I'm just like, guys, you realize how ridiculous this is, right? All of your users and you are orders of magnitude bigger than we are. Why am
Right.
I paying the bandwidth bill for
Right.
your jobs to fire up? And worse, like some of the other cases I had documented in some of my previous blogs, there was literally no way for the users to do anything about it. It was hard coded into the code. So we're still in this situation, by the way. We figured out the problem and we allowed it temporarily, but they have to update the code in a fail forward mode and wait for everybody to migrate before we can do anything about this, right?
Wow.
And so this just kind of highlights what's happening here. Again, somebody looked at this and said, oh, these things I want, they're available in Central. So that's the URL I'm going to include in this system. And now we find ourselves in a situation where a ginormous cloud company is inadvertently dependent upon what was designed to be distributing open source for builds. Like, we understand the operational importance of building software very well, but we don't have this thing set up to be serving, millions of serverless type of agent downloads at hyperscale. It just
Wow.
doesn't make any sense.
Wow. Wow. Okay.
Right?
That's
Where do
so
you go from there?
ridiculous. I know.
Right.
Okay.
And by the way, I know this exists in all the other ecosystems. Eclipse is seeing some challenges with their Open VSX, right? They created a marketplace for visual VS Code, things for all the forks of VS Code. Well, guess what? All of the AI-based tools are based on. They're based on VS Code, right?
Yeah.
So my understanding is the rise of the agent, the agentic development and all of that kind of stuff from all of these new popular tools is crushing their infrastructure, and they're sort of sitting there saying, why should our members be paying for this? They're not the ones consuming it, they're not the ones producing it, and they're not the ones building tens of $billion businesses on top of this infrastructure, yet they're driving all the costs. Right.
Yeah.
So it's a very much the same problem across the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had Deb Nicholson on a couple episodes ago talking about the Python Software Foundation. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
this was completely the point. And
Mm-hmm.
right now, as I suspect you're aware, is a lot of the donations and membership to open source foundations has been dropping off just due to global economic situations,
Absolutely.
which makes it even harder. Okay, so I want to get to the kind of what can we do part, but before we do, I would value your thoughts and opinions on. So I feel like we're reaching. I think in your letter you say like we're not yet at a crisis, but there is definitely a certain amount of, I guess, growing awareness and inner reflection on open source of like everyone is starting to notice like, holy crap, like everyone is using us, and it doesn't feel like they're using us as a friend. They're like sneaking into our house and stealing our stuff to a degree,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where
Mm-hmm.
it's almost, I don't know the word to call this, because it's not like it's open source. We made it free. We knew how this was working, but it's definitely starting to feel like there is a scale tipping in the direction of the open source universe saying like, this is not fair. I would like, am I off
Yeah.
my rocker here? What do you think?
No, you're right. And it's sort of historically, in my own case, before Maven Central was on a CDN, it relied on donated bandwidth from iBiblio,
Wow.
University of North Carolina, right,
Yeah.
back in the day, and it was kind of unreliable. So conveniently or coincidentally, that's how I got involved in Maven in the super early days. I wrote some plugins so I could just like make sure all my dependencies were downloaded so I could go get some coffee when my build
Nice.
ran and not come back and find it failed halfway through. And so repository managers and caching proxies were like, a mandatory thing to do anything real back in the day. But as we made the infrastructure more robust, I think more organizations have moved away from that. So these are simple win-win-win situations. Like these caching proxies will make sure that your organization downloads the things you need once, only once, so it saves the registry time. It's actually going to speed up all your builds because fetching them, from either an on-prem instance in your build office or in the cloud next to your infrastructure makes all of it faster. You're going to pay less CPU time for your builds, right? So it's like everybody wins if you actually do it, and most people don't do it because they take the easy way to just, code in that URL.
Yeah.
And so there have been solutions to this problem all along, and we've been worse at using them. That's part of the challenge here. But I don't think none of the package systems are really at the point of saying like we're at risk of being bankrupt right away. That's not what we're
Right.
saying, but
Well,
we're
not yet.
looking at the thing and saying, right, we're looking at the growth and saying, listen, this can't continue. This is going faster and faster, and the rate of growth is accelerating, and especially like
Yeah.
the case I talked about with AI. It used to be in some cases bounded by how fast you could put humans in seats, which had a natural limiting factor. But if all of a sudden these things can be, spun up, I can spin up 10,000 agents in 5 minutes that simulate 10,000 developers. That's great, except if all of them are provisioning, OpenVSX and going to download Python and grabbing stuff from Central times 10,000, the actual growth now does not have any natural limits to it in that regard. So
Yeah.
it could accelerate this problem even faster. And the challenge that, I observed in talking to various folks about it is there was a sensitivity to the communities that if we start making changes here, if we start putting limits in place, we start asking commercial publishers to pay their fair share, start asking huge consumers to pay their fair share, finding other ways to produce income streams to help pay for this, that the open source community might really rebel against that. And so there was a hesitancy, like everybody understood that a problem was needed, but everybody was sort of afraid to talk about it publicly due to backlash. Even when I started rolling out some of the initial rate limiting, I was a little bit worried about, a freak out. I didn't get one, which was nice. But it's always that fear. And so what we realized is like, listen, we need to be able to normalize these elements to help support this infrastructure. We need to be able to talk about these problems and have people go, right, it doesn't make sense for Sonatype to pay the bandwidth for cloud scale integrations and all of their much bigger customers. Like that just doesn't make any sense here.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and and um, and and to do it together so that the ecosystems don't pick each one apart and accuse people of being bad actors, as you know as well as I do, that has happened in many
Oh
cases,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so, a lot of people, when they read the letter, they were sort of clamoring for like, we want you to tell us what's next, what exactly to expect. And our answer was, listen, we're not trying in this first step to prescribe what the answers are. We're not trying to say that every ecosystem is going to solve this problem the same, because we all have different history. We all have different, at the low level, the way they operate, the way things they can and can't do just technologically or politically within their ecosystems is very different. The
Yeah.
problem is the same. And so what we really wanted to be able to do is go on record of explain what's happening, what the background is, explain that it is applying to all of these ecosystems more or less equally. So then when the ecosystems start to implement some of these changes, we can kind of point back to this as the body of work to say like, listen, this is what's happening and this is why. And by the way, we're all doing it.
Yeah, yeah. And you have a quote in this letter that says sustainability is not about closing access. It's about keeping the doors open, investing for the future,
That's
which
right.
is which is good because I think when conversations like this start, it's often viewed as, oh, you're closing out the people you don't like, right? And that's not at
Yeah,
all the
exactly.
intent. And
That's
I
right. And
want to
that's,
pick
yeah.
on one thing you said
Hmm.
at the beginning of this particular tangent, I'll call it, is you mentioned about everyone should run their own kind of internal mirrors and things like that. And I can
Hmm.
tell you, Brian, that's really hard to do. I have done this for many projects because I do a lot of weird stuff where I need like
Hmm.
lots of open source downloaded for whatever like mad scientist thing I'm doing. It sucks, man. It sucks hard to make that work. And I think that is probably going to be part of this discussion at some point. Now, granted, if I am a giant web scale company, yes, I can stand up a mirror, no problem. But Josh Bresser's with his computer in his basement, that's hard to do in a way that isn't horrible.
Yeah, and Josh Bresser's with his computer in his basement, I hope, is not really the problem here,
I have
right?
been rate limited by nearly every package repository on the planet
Okay.
at some point.
Well, maybe you are, but in aggregate, it's probably still relatively small, right?
For most
But
people, yes,
right,
I
right.
understand.
And this is the thing, like depending on the tool, it should be easy. If you're using Maven, it's not that hard.
Okay.
If you're using other things, but what I uncovered and I documented this in my blogs is that some of the other not Maven build tools, even in my own ecosystem, make it really hard. I only uncovered this because some large organizations were getting throttled, and I started working with them to understand, and they came back after a while and said, we can't fix this. And I'm like, what do you mean you can't fix it? And they started explaining like, oh yeah, we have all of these Gradle bills, for example, and in order to implement the change, like they already had a repository manager. 100% of the organizations I've spoken to that were in the top consumption already had Nexus or Artifactory. Like I didn't expect that to be the case, and it was.
Wow.
And then it's like, okay, why are you not effectively using it? And you unpack it, and it's like, oh, because there's no global switch, for example, in Gradle to just flip that and make it easy, like we have in Maven,
Sure.
right?
Okay.
We found other cases where, like in NPM, there was the React Native stuff was itself generating Gradle. So it was generating Gradle scripts, and there was no place further for them to be able to do it. So in one instance, the organization was telling me I'd have to go edit like 1,000 or 10,000 individual files to make this work. In another one, they were saying, I literally can't do it because the files themselves get generated at runtime. So I run
Sure.
an NPM build. It spawns off like 1,000 Gradle builds, each one of those Gradle builds downloading a bunch of the same things over and over again, and it's things like that. So I believe you that it's hard. And part of my point here is the tools in the environment should make it easy. Right? Just like the open source project I was talking about a few minutes ago, there was literally no way to change that baked in thing, but they now have a pull request open to actually fix that, which is great.
Nice.
Most of the time, this stuff is not intentional, which is why I use the word abuse carefully here. It's certainly at
Right.
least
Right.
unintentional abuse. And it's partly just because the economics never forced people to think about it. And I've used sort of, the cap and trade carbon concept about this, like the more carbon you emit, society at large tends to pay the price for that. But the individual, producer of that doesn't usually factor that in. And that was part of the logic behind the cap and trade, to put a little bit of a price on this to make people think about maybe I should do things a little bit more sustainably. And the same is true for
Yeah.
downloads. If there was a rate limit or an implied cost to some of these things, people might think, well, maybe I'm not going to, download this thing all the time. Um, and it goes on the publishers, by the way. I wrote about this in the blog that I found one publisher who was mocking a release every commit because one time in the past he had some issue with his release. So now he would build and publish to our infrastructure where we would do all of the validations on every single commit, and then he would just drop it. And I emailed him and was like, dude, what are you doing? And that's one of the things that started this. And I literally said to him, like, listen, if you don't care about wasting my money, at least be a better carbon burner for the rest of us, because you're spinning these machines for literally nothing, you know? And I was talking to another large organization publishing an SDK the other day, and they said, like, we publish every day, like 400 jars. I said, well, wow, okay. Those all change every day? They said, no, one or two of them, but we like to keep the version number the same as a convenience. And I kind of scratched my head and said, well, like, if there was a implied cost for you to do it at this scale, you would at least reflect on how much do you care about that convenience. You willing to pay for this?
Right.
Because it
Yes.
just
Right.
doesn't make sense. And in Maven Central, nothing ever comes down. So all of those things that they're just republishing the same jar and only changing the file name,
Right.
we carry that baggage forever. Right? So it's these kind of subtle things that have to change. And the only way that humans really start thinking about this is when you start applying a cost to using. You can use
Yes.
so much, but you can't use or produce beyond reasonable levels. And I
Right.
think that's generally where this is headed.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, like, what do we do? Because
Mhm.
I think this letter lays out the problem very well. I think you've made a very compelling case up to this point. But I also feel like a lot of these open source discussions about some of the challenges we have in the open source universe is, okay, great. Now what? And it feels like,
Mhm.
that South Park Underpants Gnomes episode where we're in the question mark stage and
Right.
profit is next.
Right.
But
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things certainly I've explored partnerships with others in the ecosystem that are interested in making users aware of things like they support end of life components, and working with partnerships where they pay us to help get access to that, get that visibility is a thing I've explored. We've explored offering to organizations who can't get to a reasonable consumption to basically pay for higher tiers. We've explored uh, publishers, some of these higher frequency publishers maybe paying. We haven't moved in that direction yet, but I don't think it's unreasonable to ask a commercial organization producing hundreds of jars every single day because they can to help pay for some of this infrastructure. Right.
yeah,
And so we're millions of dollars away from break even. Right. So this isn't about profit seeking. It's about trying to at least balance this out. And
right.
it will, if we do it right, it will mean that Josh in his basement can continue to do things at a reasonable level. Um, Mostly for free. If you want to make your stuff go faster, then maybe you can pay a little bit more. I mean, that's true in the cloud. You can always buy a bigger, faster machine if you want your answer faster,
Right.
right? So that
Right.
doesn't feel completely insane for you to say, like, I could do it. I'm gonna have to do it below the limits, but if I want it now, then I chip in some money. Um, you know, um, and those types of things, I think, start to become reasonable.
Yes. I agree with everything you said, but the interesting part is going to be, but open source is free, Brian, right? I feel
Yeah,
like we
that
have this
that
ingrained in our heads,
it
but
is free. Listen, I'm making all of this open source stuff available for you to get. All I'm saying is, like, I don't think it's fair for you to come in and take it 500,000 times a month,
yes, that's
right?
fair. I mean, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and worse, somebody used this analogy, and I think it's useful. It's like, listen, if you were running a soup kitchen, and some people are coming in and getting soup, you're happy to serve them. And sometimes you might wonder, like, does that person in the suit really need to get free food? Like, I'm going to give them free food. But I think everybody would say what's not okay is for somebody to come in and take the whole pot of soup and then go sit outside and start selling it. Right?
yes, that
And
is
that's
yes,
that's close to what we're talking about here. We're saying, listen, we're happy to serve this. We're happy to provide these as services for the world and to do it for free, to help open source, to help all of these things. We are part of the ecosystem, right? But we just don't think it's right in that context for somebody to say, like, I don't want to run a caching proxy, so I'm just going to download this 500,000 times this month. I
yeah,
don't think
yeah.
anybody would stand up and say, like, no, that's against the open source ethos for you to say, don't do that.
But
I mean, I certainly would hope that's the case.
they're gonna say it, and you know it, right? Like,
Well,
oh, poor
I,
little
th- I, th-
me.
listen, I don't know. I mean,
It's not fair, but
it, it, I I've been surprised. I think most people have looked at what we've said and said, yes, this is logical. We haven't seen any crazy conspiracy theories pop up yet, which is good. And I think that tells me we're on the right path. We're thinking about it the right way. We are very cautious about making sure that we're not violating open source norms here. We're just trying to highlight a potential problem. It's great that open source is so important to all of these infrastructure pieces, to all of these things. It's helping, society get better things faster, all those things. That's all great. But we can't continue to just mine these things indefinitely. It's like fishing a species to extinction.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
slow down. Let's think about how we can provide mechanisms to make this sustainable. And then we can build on top of that.
Yeah, and actually there's I'll put a link in the show notes, but the Atlantic Council wrote a really nice paper about open source sustainability, and they compare the ecosystem to like the environment of like water is their example, right?
Yes.
Where if you can do things to use water in a way that it will be available theoretically forever, or you can do it in a way that in like 5 years, like no one can drink the water and it's completely ruined.
That's
And
exactly right. Yep.
and
Yep.
right, we haven't reached that point yet, but let's make sure we keep it, healthy and good. So, okay, I want to hold your feet a little more to the fire here, Brian, because you've talked about some, I think, interesting ideas, but like, what are the actual next steps? Like, if I'm someone who actually cares about this, like, what can we do? Like, what are some actual real things we can start doing to help push this forward and make a difference?
Well, I mean, the very practical thing is take a close look at how your systems are interacting with these public registries. Can you reduce your footprint?
Sure.
And I've had some people reach out to me and ask, and and I've pulled some statistics for people to make it easy. I understand that it can be hard for organizations at massive scale to really get their arms around this, but we're willing to help provide that visibility if you're trying to solve the problem. So that's the most practical thing, is to reduce your footprint. If you're publishing these things on every commit just as a test, maybe stop. If you're publishing everything's this over and over again every day, maybe stop. Those are things you can do today. If you're building a tool in the ecosystem and you're just downloading the same metadata from these registries over and over again, same thing. Don't do that. Cache it. If you're a business, build a cache. Make yourself not dependent upon these things. Like, that's just good business practice. Why are you operationally dependent upon, open source infrastructure paid by somebody else? That's not a good business plan in general, right? So these are the kinds of things. And again, these things have generally been unintentional, and that's part of trying to raise the awareness here, right? Putting limits in place, charging for higher tiers, those are things that people can choose to do, or they can choose to reduce their footprint. In either way, we help solve the problem, right?
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, but that's very different and new, right? I mean, I'll use Docker Hub as my example. I'll pick on them because, Docker Hub used to be just like Wild West. And then they put usage limits on their data. In fact, in the past, I have paid for a subscription just because like I need to pull more stuff than I can pull. So I guess I'm giving you money now and that solves my problem, right? Or I was actually like several hours into trying to set up a proper, Docker cache. And I'm like, this is too much work. Here's $60. Like, we're done here. And it was, good for them and good for me in that regard.
That's right. And I think that's a reasonable outcome, right? And that's the case. And it's like, I think you would justifiably feel different if you weren't able to get any of those things, if you had to pay just to get access to bit one.
Sure.
That's I think over the line, and nobody here is talking about that, right? But
your
convenience, your time is valuable, and you can pay a little bit more to get it faster. That's what I was saying before, and that feels like a fair trade exchange of value, and that's all that we're asking for here.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a very new idea in this universe. Like, it will be very interesting to see how this unfolds as we go forward.
Yes, it is so new, and that is why everybody felt like nobody wanted to speak up until they were all speaking up together.
Yeah, which is great, which is really cool. And that's one thing you did mention to me, is you kind of brought this up with some of the ecosystems, and they were all like, oh yeah, I have that problem too. But no one was saying it in public, which is, it's like everyone was suffering in silence, right?
More or less, yeah. I mean, like I said, I've been chronicling my journey as I've kind of tried to rationalize this. But once I understood the scale and started talking to others and realized like this is a problem for everybody, and maybe even in some cases more acute, the not for profits. They don't have big banks to lean back on. If
Yeah.
our bandwidth bill goes crazy, my CFO is going to call and ask me what's going on. But if I'm a open
Right.
source project and I lose a couple of, or an open source foundation, I lose a couple of members and my bandwidth bill, quadrupled in a year, what do I do? There's no place to fall back on, right? So that's when I realized, like, wait a minute, yeah,
Right. And I
go ahead.
know in that sort of situation, there's a lot of donated bandwidth, right? And that's
hmm
also not
hmm
sustainable for the donators, right? Because I'm sure they're feeling
Yes,
the pressure as
yes.
well.
That is. I'm
So,
glad you brought that up. I mean, because Sonatype's not a not for profit, we weren't able to get that bandwidth for free. I
right.
tried. We recently moved to Cloudflare, and they're really great in working with us on this. They understand the importance of it. But everybody else is getting it basically for free. And I cautioned them. I said, listen, don't make the same mistake. Like at some point, that's going to get, significant enough that it's going to be problematic. You should start thinking about how to keep this growth under control now and envision a future where you don't have to be dependent upon one provider to give it to you for free. You're
Yeah.
going to make
Yeah.
the monster bigger and it will be harder later. So use the opportunity now to get these things under control.
Yep. For sure. Well, and that happened to, it was one of I think the C sharp, um, like NuGet or one of those, repos.
Cocoa
I can't remember
pods?
the name of it now.
Yeah.
One of the,
Was it
what the .NET, package managers
yeah, was it
that, yeah,
was it Cocoa Pods maybe? Yeah.
that might have been. Yeah, they lost their CDN and it was just chaos
Mhm.
for a
Mhm.
long
Yeah.
time. Yeah, yeah. All right, Brian. This has been a fire hose, but I think this is a good topic. I think also like one of the challenges now is to find ways to get this word out. And so this is like my plea to everyone listening is read the letter and tell all your friends, because while sometimes to us security nerds it'll be like, oh, everyone should know this, it was published on the OpenSSF blog, I have a
Right.
suspicion with the size of tech, this is a very real problem that is going to take time to just make sure it gets to the places it needs to go.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it's a big deal.
Yeah.
All right, man.
Like I said, I think I do think that over the long term, when we sort this out, it can be an opportunity. It can help break the cycle that we've all been in around paying the maintainers. Nobody wants to pay the maintainers. The
Yeah.
infrastructure, if the infrastructure starts to take care of itself and, maybe starts producing a little bit extra, that extra can go back into, the actual maintainers who are driving all of this. Maybe this
Yep.
is the final thing instead of just relying on goodwill donations. Um, you know, I
I
think so. I just don't know how it continues otherwise.
I don't think it's a final thing, Brian. I think it might be the beginning of the first.
Maybe,
So,
maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
it's been a treat, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
And I cannot wait to talk to you in a little while to see how this is all going. So it should be fun.
Yep.